case, we'll do national parks and biosphere reserves, wildlife sanctuaries. So let's get started now. Wildlife sanctuaries, national parks, and biosphere reserve. Now you should know a bit of history so that how we differentiate them. All three these were set up under the Wildlife Protection Act 1972. Wildlife sanctuaries, these are mostly specific to certain species. Okay, tiger sanctuary, black buck sanctuary, elephant sanctuary. These are specific to a species. And these are set up mostly by executive orders. What I mean by this is governments can set this up. So that way they are relatively easier to establish. So governments can do this. It requires an executive decision of the government. Again, they can set it up. And wildlife sanctuaries, they are relatively smaller. They are more permissible. They are more permissible as in they do allow for some of the human activities. Okay, like some bit of grazing can be done here, some bit of wood cutting can be done here. They do allow the minor produce of the forest to be used. So they are more permissible, they are smaller, and they do not have definite boundaries. They do not have definite boundaries. Whereas national parks, these are more about the habitat. National parks, they are much more larger. They include habitats, not simply one life form, but maybe a group of life forms and the habitat, the forests, the grasslands together. And these are larger. Now, these are always set up after certain legislations. The parliament can set up, the state legislation can pass a law to set up. They are more restrictive, as in most of the activities are not allowed in national parks. Wildlife sanctuaries are more permissible. Wildlife sanctuaries can allow some bit of grazing, I said some bit of cutting of trees also. They do allow for people to collect their minor forest produce. But the national parks, these are more restrictive. They do not allow. They are passed by legislations and they are governed by more strict laws. And these have definite boundaries. Whereas biosphere reserves are very, very large. They were recommended as a part of what's called as Man and Biosphere Program. So we have MAB program. This was a program initiative by UNESCO in 1971. Okay, so these have been set up as a part of the international initiatives. So they were set up as a part of UNESCO recommendations. 1971 they were set up, and these are much larger. And the focus in Biosphere Reserve is the conservation of biodiversity. It is not only about one life form. It is not only about one species. It's not about only one habitat. It protects, it manages. An example of in situ conservation of the entire biodiversity. Okay, and inside a biosphere reserves, there can be many national parks, there can be wildlife sanctuaries. Okay, and biosphere reserves in India, there are 18 of them. Okay, the last that I kept track of, there are 18 biosphere reserves, and these also were set up under 1972 Wildlife Protection Act. So the UNESCO passes or recommends in 1971, and in 72 we set up the biosphere reserves. Now biosphere reserves typically have a structure. There are 3 zones to a biosphere reserve. There is a core area, which is something like a national park, but far more restrictive. Inside the core area, nobody is allowed, but probably the officials, and under special circumstances, maybe some special passes can be given. No tourism is allowed here. Okay, so core area is very, very restrictive. Around the core area is a buffer zone. Buffer zone can have some restricted human activities, like some education centers, some research can be done here. And around the buffer area, there is a transition zone. The transition zone, this can have local tribes. The transition zone can have villages that depend on the forest produce of the biosphere reserve. So this is structured along certain type of differential treatment of the area. This type of differentiation we do not have in national parks. We do not have wildlife sanctuaries. These are, in any case, very, very small. Okay, so have some idea about, and all of these three are examples of in situ conservation. Conservation is done in the site itself. So, if you know about biodiversity management, we can have ex situ and we can have in situ. Ex situ, like the botanical gardens that we have, the zoological parks or the zoos that we have. We can create gene banks also, where the tissues and the genes can be preserved in test tubes. Those are ex situ conservations. All the three are examples of in situ conservation: wildlife sanctuary, national parks, and biosphere reserves. India, the Sundarbans. The Sundarbans is the largest biosphere reserve that we have. It's among the largest that we have. So I think this takes care of the basic idea about what are national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, and biosphere reserves. Now, so one more special category. Please focus here. One more special category of conservation are the wetland conservation. Now, wetlands, they are a very specific type of geographical locations. In wetlands, the most important aspect is that the groundwater is literally at the surface of the land. So they are swamps. Okay, so wetlands are of different categories. Mangroves are wetlands. We have swamps as wetlands. We can have lakes and their littoral regions as wetlands. So one of the important aspects of wetland is that the groundwater table is right up to the surface. And that's how they become soggy, they become swamps. Wetlands also include lagoons. All these four types are different type of, like say, lakes. A Sukhna lake is a wetland. Harike lake is a wetland. Mangroves, Bhitarkanika forests are wetlands. Lagoons like Chilka Lake is a lagoon, a wetland. Venbanad is a lagoon and a wetland. So isme kya hai? The groundwater. So in heavy rains, they actually can be submerged underwater. So Sambar Lake is again a wetland. So wetlands are a special category of ecosystems. They are a special category of ecosystems. And each of these types, whether they're mangroves or swamps or lakes or lagoons, each of these types will have some kind of differentiation in terms of local conditions and the type of species that they protect. In most cases, the wetlands are more important for their forests, not so much for the wildlife, not so much because of the birds alone. The forest, the vegetation, that's more important. Now, when I say forest, I could also include vegetation. Whereas if it's a lagoon and a lake, you also have the natural fishes, which are equally important part. Invariably, the wetlands also become bird sanctuaries. Harike can be swamps, wetlands, and Harike region is also a bird sanctuary. And wherever you have got like Okla is like a wetland, Okla is also a bird sanctuary. There's a special case, which is swamps and water accumulation. General discussion on how to write about these kind of entries. Some of the rules that you should know is here. Now see, one rule is whenever you mark a wildlife sanctuary, whenever you mark a bird sanctuary or national park, it's always nice to use a green color. And while marking them, do not mark a dot like a city. You always mark a small area. Invariably, these type of conservation sites, they're across sometimes 2 or 3 districts. They're rarely just one town. They're rarely just one city or a part of a city. In most cases, they are, unless it's a bird sanctuary smaller. Otherwise, in most cases, they're across 2 or 3 districts. So when you mark a wildlife sanctuary, khaskar a biosphere reserve, do not limit to mark just the dot. Use green color. This is the cartographical principles that we use. Use green color and shade a small area. I'll show how big or small your shading can be. That's one. Now, when you write about these locations, focus on 3-4 things. One is, do talk about the location. When I say location, talk about the state, talk about some nearby town or city location. Do mention which part of the state and which part, southern part, eastern part, northern part, near the borders. So the location should not be only in terms of one particular point. So if they ask you, say, the Desert National Park, you don't just say it's in Rajasthan. You say it is in Rajasthan, in the western part of Rajasthan, near the town of Jaisalmer, not far from the India-Pakistan boundary. It's part of Marusthali region or the desert ecosystems. And location, remember, is a very strong element of geography. So if I ask you, write about Sundarbans, okay, or mark Sundarbans, you mention Sundarbans, West Bengal, Sundarbans, okay, bordering the parts of Bangladesh. It is the lower stretches of the Ganga Delta, and Sundarbans is across the international border. The Indian part is marked as Sundarbans Biosphere Reserve. Then they ask you, write about, say, Agastha Malai. So you mentioned Agastha Malai, southern part of India, southern part of Tamil Nadu. Talk about Cardamom Hills there. So you always mention in reference to some locations or some towns, not simply tell us exactly where it is. Okay, so do stress on this. The second aspect, wherever possible, do relate it with the physiography. Okay, is it mountainous areas? It is plain areas? Physiography in with respect to maybe the mountains, with respect to the plains. It could be part of the coastal regions. So Bhitarkanika forest. So do mention Bhitarkanika forest in the state of Odisha, along the coastal areas of Odisha. This is in the not very far or along the stretch of Paradeep and Kendrapada. Okay, so do talk about the physiographic areas. That gives us some element of the natural environment. Do talk about the climate. At least do mention if they are wet areas, if they are dry areas, if they are semi-arid regions. In most cases, if you know the location, you can also approximate the idea of how much rainfall. You can always talk in terms of more than 100, okay, around or less than 70, very dry conditions, less than 40. So these kind of approximations you definitely can make. So this is again hardcore geography, the climatic aspects. Now once you know the climate, you can also discuss a bit of vegetation. You don't have to know too much about vegetation, just something just as simple as talk about that they are dry forests, say they are wet evergreen forests. You could talk about some wet evergreen species. You cannot go wrong with sal and teak in India, unless you're talking in the reference of mangrove forests, unless you talk in the reference of Himalayan coniferous regions. Almost all parts of India will have some amount of sal and teak. So sal and teak, you cannot go wrong. If it's the desert regions or dry regions, you cannot go wrong with the dry deciduous species. Okay, very common species, mango, you have got neem. Okay, Rajasthan will have acacia or babool. Is a pretty common species of the drier parts. In parts of India, of Delhi and areas bordering Delhi and Rajasthan, a very common species that we have is kikar. It's a large tree with small leaves and lot of spine needles, lot of thorns. Kikar, acacia. So have an idea about the vegetation. And if you are in the parts of Western Ghats, Southern Hill Complex, or in the parts of Eastern Ghats, do talk about the human aspects, including plantation. You can talk about invariably the forests of southern India. They will have spices plantations. Most of them are restricted. If you're towards northeastern part, do talk about having tea gardens. So Jaldapada, Jalpaiguri regions, Darjeeling, Singalila National Park, these are in the vicinity of the tea forests or the tea gardens. So talk about the human aspects, in particular the type of land use. You cannot go wrong with talking about tourism, eco-tourism. You cannot go wrong with this. So these are some of the generic information. And you should mention the species and the conservation associated with that particular national park or wildlife sanctuary. Now species may, now see if you do not remember anything, almost all the national parks of India they are common in 2-3 things. Generally, unless you're talking about Himalayan areas or talking about extreme deserts, Rajasthan, almost all national park will have some tigers or the other. You cannot go wrong with elephants. You cannot go wrong with cheetal. Cheetal is one type of a deer, pretty common across good parts of India. Spotted deer hai cheetal, mostly found in northern parts, otherwise also pretty widespread. Central India, talking about MP, parts of Gujarat, Chhattisgarh, the central India, including parts of Maharashtra, you cannot go wrong again with black buck. So I'm just telling you some of the important species that you can mention. So unless it is in Ladakh region, unless it is Rajasthan, deserts, unless it is going to be parts of Kashmir, a high altitude Hemis National Park. Most of the national parks of India, wildlife sanctuaries in India, biosphere reserves, are important for tiger conservation. Elephants is pretty common in India. Cheetal, this is a deer. Central India, black buck. In good parts of central India, we have black buck as a species. We also have certain exclusive conservation of black buck also. We have the black buck wildlife sanctuary in Belvedar, which is Gujarat. So black buck is pretty common. Good parts will have this. And do talk about in Western Ghats, good number of them are in Western Ghats. I'm talking about Nilgiris. Do mention the hotspots. Do mention that they are part of some hotspots. Do mention the unique endemic flora and fauna of Western Ghats. Western Ghats, which includes like the Southern Hill Complex, I'm talking Nilgiris and South. An important species is Nilgiri Thar, T-A-H-R. It's like a deer. Nilgiri. Do talk about a lot of endemic frogs. Endemic frogs. There's 2-3 names of species. If you are in parts of Northeast, a pretty common species of Northeast, Nagaland, Assam, is the bird called a horned bill. So you're talking about mangroves. Talk about 2-3 species like screw pine, rhizophora, nipa trees, NIPA. Any coastal regions, whether it is coastal regions of Malabar, coastal regions of Odisha, Andhra Pradesh. Talk about the mangrove forest, Goa also for that matter, parts of Konkan, screw pine, rhizophora, nipa. And if you are in parts of the Sundarbans, to talk about Sundari trees. So this should give you a fair amount of content to write on. Say, in maps, if you are studying maps exclusive of your appreciation of geography, then you are in trouble. You have to understand Indian geography, the climate, the physiography, what type of features across different parts of India. You must know about the vegetation. And then you converge all that conversation, that discussion into writing about the place. So if you know this much, this is a fair good amount of content to write across these type of entries. So what we have is, I said, one rule is, do use green color. Do not mark as a dot. You mark a small area. Don't mark as one small dot. You mark a small area. Because I said, these type of entries invariably are across 2 or 3 districts. They're rarely one small town. They're rarely one city. And when you write about these places, these are what you will focus on. In case you missed out, I said talk about the location. Location with respect to the state, which part of the state. Do talk about the proximity with the town, with the city. Talk about the physiography. What type of landscape? Plateau hai, valleys hai. Which we're talking about physiography. It would be nice if you also know what are the rivers in the vicinity. Chambal River, Godavari Basin, Indravati Basin, part of Sutsatla River system, Jhelum River. So if you know the rivers, Jim Corbett Park, Ram Ganga River you can mention, Valmiki National Park, we talk about River Gandak, lot of them along River Kaveri. So wherever possible, you do know the rivers, plus whether they are mountains, whether they are plateaus, they are coastal regions, so don't know about this much. Then I said, do know about the climate and relate the climate with vegetation. And climate, you do not have to know all specifics. In general, cold hai, warm hai, high altitude mountain hai. Is it wetter areas? It is drier areas? Is it semi-arid regions? Even if you use these kind of words, it does have an impact. If it is foothill area, invariably it will have relatively better condition. And relate the climate with vegetation. And that too, if you do know about some species, like I said, you cannot go wrong with sal, you cannot go wrong with teak, unless it is coniferous belt. Like acacia is also pretty common in the dry regions, acacia. You can talk about a species called as keekar, 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 in the parts of dry regions of Delhi towards Rajasthan. The Delhi Ridge has a lot of keekar species. So do know the specific vegetation wherever you can. If you remember your geography classes, we did talk about red sanders, the one type of very specific species in Seshachalam forest around Kadapa. So red sanders. You do know about sandalwood. The lower slopes of Himalayas will always have poplar. The coniferous regions, they always will have cedar or deodar. So if you know some species, like I said, no, these are some things I expect you to know from your geography regular classes and apply them to the discussions of climate and vegetation. Then please do add human aspects. In human aspects, okay, talk about what type of forest land use. In some cases, I'll help you wherever I can. You can also write about some tribes that live in and around that forest. So you can talk about tribes, human aspects, talk about ecotourism and its prospects. Okay. Do talk about species, climate, vegetation, human aspects. Now, this is the more direct aspect that we must write on: species of animals. Here we talked about the species of vegetation. Now you talk about the species of the animals. You cannot go wrong with tiger, elephant, cheetal. Again, some areas, black buck. You cannot go wrong with the drier parts of India having peacock, the wetter parts of India having monkeys and apes. So play around with some kind of species. Of course, some of them are very specific. I'll talk about that also. But these 4 or 5 names to mention. And then I said, you can always talk about some environmental aspects related to specific ecosystems like Western Ghats. Western Ghats, Nilgiris, they're hotspot. Even hotspot, to वैसे even the eastern Himalayas are hotspots. And do talk about the species there, okay, some of which I mentioned, hornbill. So I said mangrove as an example where you can have discussions on specific type of species. So I hope you have jotted this conversation down, what to write about. Say the reason why I tell this to you is there is a common question I have been asked, and I've told this to you. You do not need to buy a book for maps. It's a very wrong strategy, because yes, the books will have information, but the information is of no use. You cannot afford to read details of 400, 500 entries. It's not possible. So when you write about the maps, when you write about the location, the places, you have to use your geographical understanding, okay, and write from this type of generic content. And in most cases, if you know the location, exactly know where you're going to mark it, once you know the location, there should not be a problem trying to write about that particular national park or whatever. I think you understand this conversation. That was the suggestion of how to go about your writing part.